Welcome back to the deep dive. Feels like we've been swimming in cybersecurity news lately. I mean, every time you turn around, there's a new breach or vulnerability.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep up with. But don't worry, that's what we're here for, right? To help you cut through the noise and figure out what really matters.
Exactly. Consider this your crash course in all things cyber. And trust me, we've got a lot to unpack today. We're talking data leaks, software glitches, you name it.
Well, let's dive right in then, shall we? And I think a good place to start is with Transact. They're a crypto firm, and they got hit with a pretty massive data breach recently.
Crypto, huh? Okay, so we're talking digital currency, online transactions, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And unfortunately for Transact, their security measures weren't quite up to par. Over 92,000 users had their information compromised.
92,000. Wow, that's not good. What kind of information was leaked?
Pretty much everything you'd need for a nasty case of identity theft. We're talking passports, selfies, proof of residency, documents, the works.
Ouch. That's a goldmine for identity thieves. What happened? How did the breach occur?
Phishing attack. Someone managed to get their hands on some login credentials, probably through a cleverly disguised email. You know, the kind that tricks you into clicking a malicious link.
Ah, phishing. It's amazing how effective that still is. A good reminder for everyone listening, always double check those sender addresses, folks. But, it's not just these tech companies that are vulnerable, right?
Sadly, no.
Yeah.
We've also got good old Johnson & Johnson, the pharmaceutical giant. They had a breach too.
Johnson & Johnson. Now, what could they possibly want with all that baby powder data?
Well, it seems like no one is immune these days. Over 3,200 people were affected by the Johnson & Johnson breach. In another case that really highlights how widespread this problem is, we have Winnebago Public Schools.
That one.
Yeah, the school district in Nebraska. They were hit with a cyber attack that crippled their entire network.
A school district.
Yeah.
So much for those "the dog ate my homework" excuses, huh? But seriously, that's unsettling. Schools, hospitals, government institutions, they're all fair game these days.
It really goes to show that the threat landscape is changing. These attacks aren't just about stealing data anymore. They're about causing real-world disruption. And speaking of lasting consequences, remember the SolarWinds hack from back in 2020?
SolarWinds? Oh yeah, that was a big one. I thought they'd put that whole mess behind them by now.
Not quite. It seems the aftershocks are still being felt. The SEC recently went after 4 major tech companies: Unisys Corp., Avaya Holdings Corp., Checkpoint Software Technologies, and Mimecast Limited for downplaying the impact of that SolarWinds breach.
So they knew they had a security problem but tried to sweep it under the rug. Not exactly the transparency we need in today's digital world.
It really highlights a crucial point. Cybersecurity isn't just about firewalls and encryption, it's about ethical conduct. Hiding a breach only erodes trust and creates bigger problems down the line.
Like trying to hide a stain on a white shirt, it'll just keep spreading. Speaking of messes, remember that ransomware attack on Infosys McCamish Systems, MS? Well, it seems Wells Fargo got caught in the crossfire.
Yes, 6 million Wells Fargo customers were impacted by that attack. It really drives home the interconnected nature of our digital lives. One breach can have ripple effects far beyond the initial target.
Like a digital domino effect, right? Even if you're not directly targeted, you could still get caught in the fallout.
And it just goes to show that understanding these vulnerabilities is crucial for everyone, not just the big corporations.
That's why we're diving deep, right? To make sure everyone's in the know.
Exactly. And speaking of vulnerabilities, someone is allegedly trying to sell access to Stanford University's admin panel on the dark web.
Stanford University. Wow, those student loans must be really hurting if they're resorting to selling admin access. But seriously, what kind of damage could be done if those credentials actually worked?
It'd be a field day for cyber criminals. We're talking access to everything. Sensitive student data, financial records, research, you name it.
A stark reminder about the importance of strong passwords and two-factor authentication, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Even institutions with supposedly top-notch security can be vulnerable.
Well, on that note, maybe we should shift gears a bit and talk about some of those software vulnerabilities that have been keeping security researchers up at night.
Sounds good. And one that definitely caught our eye involves VMware, the company behind a lot of cloud computing and virtualization technology. They've been scrambling to patch a critical flaw in their vCenter server.
VMware, vCenter server. Okay, for those of us who aren't tech wizards, can you give us the layman's terms on this one? What exactly is at stake here?
Imagine being able to hijack all the servers a company relies on. That's essentially what this vulnerability could allow. An attacker could potentially take complete control of a company's entire virtual infrastructure.
Okay, that sounds bad. Really bad.
And that's not all. Styra, a company that specializes in authorization policies for cloud-native apps, they had a bit of a security hiccup themselves. They've been busy patching a hole in their open policy agent software.
Authorization policies, cloud-native apps. You're losing me a little bit here. What's the take-home message for the average person?
In a nutshell, it's all about who has access to what in the cloud. This particular vulnerability could have let attackers bypass security rules and access things they shouldn't. Sensitive data, applications, that sort of thing.
So another case of potential data leaks and security breaches. Is it just me, or does it seem like there's a new vulnerability popping up every other day?
And those are just the ones we know about. We haven't even gotten to zero-day vulnerabilities yet.
0-day? What's that? Some new cybersecurity buzzword.
Not exactly. A zero-day vulnerability is one that's being exploited before the developers even know it exists. And there's one making the rounds right now that involves Samsung processors, the ones they use in many Android devices.
Samsung processor. Okay, now you're talking about something that affects pretty much everyone. What's the potential damage with this one?
Well, this particular vulnerability could allow an attacker to gain full control of your device. They could access your camera, microphone location data, you name it. Basically, they could turn your smartphone into a spying device without you even knowing.
Okay, now that's just creepy. What can people do to protect themselves against this kind of thing?
The good news is that Samsung has already released a patch for this vulnerability. The bad news is people actually have to install the updates. So yeah, if you haven't updated your phone lately, now might be a good time.
Software updates. They're not just annoying interruptions anymore. So we've covered data leaks, software glitches, even a hardware vulnerability. With all these threats out there, it makes you wonder who's ultimately responsible when things go wrong. Is it the companies making the software? Or are users expected to be cybersecurity experts?
Ah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it brings us to a very important debate about software liability.
Software liability. So you're saying, like, if a company's software fails and someone gets hacked, they could be held legally responsible.
Exactly. There's a growing movement to hold software companies more accountable for the security of their products. But as you can imagine, it's a complicated issue with valid arguments on both sides.
Well, let's hear them. What are the arguments for and against holding software companies liable for these breaches and vulnerabilities?
Those who support stricter liability argue that it would force companies to prioritize security from the get-go, right? They say it's like any other industry. If a car manufacturer sells a car with faulty brakes, they're held responsible. Software shouldn't be any different.
Yeah, that makes sense. A faulty braking system can have some pretty serious consequences, just like a software vulnerability, but I'm sure the software companies have their own side of the story. What are their arguments against stricter liability?
Well, they argue that it would stifle innovation. They say software development's all about pushing the boundaries, experimenting, taking risks, and sometimes mistakes are made along the way. So their argument is that if companies are constantly looking over their shoulder, worried about getting sued over every single vulnerability, they'll be less likely to take those risks, which could ultimately slow down progress.
So it's a balancing act, right? We want secure software, but we also don't want to stifle innovation. How do we find that sweet spot? How do we make sure companies are taking security seriously without bringing the entire industry to a grinding halt?
That's the million-dollar question. One idea that's been floated is a tiered approach to liability. So the severity of the consequences and the company's efforts to prevent or mitigate the vulnerability would be taken into account.
So a minor vulnerability with minimal impact wouldn't necessarily lead to a lawsuit, but a major security flaw that a company knew about and did nothing to fix, that's a different story.
Exactly. It's about finding a nuanced approach that holds companies accountable without being overly punitive.
Makes sense. But while all of that gets sorted out, what can we, the everyday users, do to protect ourselves? It's easy to feel kind of powerless in all of this. Like, we're just supposed to trust that the companies making this technology have our best interests at heart.
Well, for starters, you're already ahead of the game just by being aware of these issues. Knowledge is power, right? But in terms of practical steps, it really boiled down to staying vigilant and adopting what we call a layered approach to security.
Layered approach. Sounds complicated.
It's not as complex as it sounds. It basically means using multiple layers of protection to make it as difficult as possible for the bad guys to succeed. And it all starts with the basics. Strong, unique passwords for all your accounts.
Okay, so no more using password 123 for everything. What else?
And enable two-factor authentication wherever possible. That extra layer of verification can make a world of difference.
Got it. Two-factor authentication check.
And for goodness sake, keep your software updated. You know those annoying update notifications you get all the time?
Yes.
Those are often patching newly discovered vulnerabilities.
So they're not just a way for companies to show off their latest bells and whistles.
Well, sometimes they are. But those security updates are crucial. And speaking of security essentials, don't forget about antivirus software. It might seem a bit old school, but it's still a valuable line of defense against known threats.
Like a digital shield against those nasty cyber bugs?
Precisely. And speaking of shields, with election season just around the corner here in the US, we need to be extra vigilant about phishing scams and fake websites.
You mean those emails promising me $1 million if I just click on this one link?
Well, those, but also more sophisticated scams designed to trick you into revealing personal information or even donating to a fake campaign. And the scary part is they're getting really good at making these scams look legitimate. They're even using platforms like AWS and Cloudflare to make their malicious websites look more convincing.
So how do we spot these wolves in sheep's clothing? What are some telltale signs that something's not quite right?
One thing to watch out for is the domain name. Take a close look at the spelling. Is it slightly off? Or maybe it's using a different top-level domain than you'd expect.
So if I see a campaign website ending in .net instead of .com, that's a red flag.
It could be. And always be wary of unsolicited emails asking for personal information, especially if they create a sense of urgency or seem too good to be true. Legitimate organizations are never going to ask for your social security number or credit card details over email.
Okay, that's good to know. Double check those URLs, don't click on suspicious links, and be wary of unsolicited requests for personal information.
Got it. But let's circle back to the election security issue for a moment. You mentioned earlier that a whopping 75% of U.S. Senate campaign websites are vulnerable to phishing and spoofing attacks. That's a pretty scary statistic.
It is concerning, and one of the key vulnerabilities they often lack is proper implementation of DMARC.
DMR, okay, you're going to have to break that one down for me. What is DMRC and why is it so important for election security? So DMRC stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication Reporting and Conformance. It's basically an email authentication protocol that helps ensure that emails claiming to be from a specific domain, like a campaign website, are actually from that domain and not spoofed by someone else.
So it's like a digital signature for emails verifying that the sender is who they claim to be.
Exactly. Without DMRs, it's relatively easy for attackers to send phishing emails that look like they're from a campaign or a candidate, which can have serious consequences.
Like tricking people into donating to the wrong campaign or revealing sensitive personal information.
Exactly. So DMRC adds that extra layer of security that can help protect voters from being misled.
It sounds like we've covered a lot of ground here. I mean, we've talked about data breaches, software vulnerabilities, phishing scams, even the complexities of software liability. It's a lot to take in.
It is. But we're not done yet. There's one more area I think we need to touch on, something that often gets overlooked in these discussions, and that's hardware security.
Hardware security, you mean like the physical components of our computers and devices. What does that have to do with all this cyber stuff?
Everything. We tend to get so focused on software vulnerabilities, on the code itself, that we forget that all of that software runs on hardware. And what if the foundation itself is flawed? What if there's a vulnerability in a computer chip, for example?
A flaw in a computer chip. That sounds like something out of a science fiction movie, but I'm guessing it's more fact than fiction these days.
Unfortunately, it's a very real concern. A single vulnerability in a widely used processor, for instance, could have catastrophic consequences.
Catastrophic how? Give me an example.
Imagine a backdoor built into millions of devices, giving attackers access to your data, your camera, your microphone, basically. Complete control over your device without you even knowing.
Okay, now that's just creepy. Are you telling me that our computers and smartphones could be spying on us without us even knowing it? That's straight out of a dystopian novel.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? And while it might sound far-fetched, it's a possibility we need to be aware of.
So what can we do about it? Should we all be running out to buy new computers and phones every time a new hardware vulnerability is discovered?
I wouldn't say panic is necessary just yet. It's not about replacing all your devices, but about understanding the potential risks and demanding better from the companies that make these products.
So more informed consumers lead to more secure products. Like the sound of that. What else can we do on an individual level to address this hardware vulnerability issue?
Stay informed. Keep up with the latest news and research on hardware security. There are organizations out there advocating for more secure hardware design and manufacturing practices. Support them. And when you are in the market for new devices, do your research. Consider the manufacturer's track record on security.
So it's not just about the brand name or the latest and greatest features, it's about digging a little deeper and understanding the security implications of our tech choices. It's about being informed consumers, demanding better from the companies we're giving our money to.
Exactly. It's not just on us as individuals, though. Policymakers and industry leaders, they have a huge role to play here.
So we need stricter regulations, stronger standards for hardware security.
Absolutely. Similar to what we already have for software.
And it's about changing the mindset, right? It's not enough to just tack on security as an afterthought. It needs to be baked in from the very beginning.
100%. We need to be proactive, not reactive, building security into the very DNA of our technology. And that requires a team effort. Policymakers, industry leaders, security researchers, even everyday users, we all have a role to play.
Like we're all in this together, navigating this crazy digital world.
Well said. And, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. Data breaches, software vulnerabilities, election security, even hardware security. It's a lot.
My brain's a little fried, to be honest. But in a good way. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, you know? You uncover all these hidden complexities.
And the more we know, the better equipped we are to protect ourselves. But as you continue your own deep dive, here's something to chew on. We talk about cyber attacks, disrupting elections, stealing data, even spying on us. But what about physical harm?
Physical harm. Wait, like someone hacking into a power grid and causing a blackout.
Exactly. Think about it. Traffic lights, hospitals, everything's connected these days. The potential for a cyber attack to jump from the digital world to the physical world is very real.
Okay, now that's a scary thought.
It is. It's something we need to be talking about. So as you continue exploring the world of cybersecurity, remember that it's not just about protecting your data anymore. It's about protecting our way of life.
That's a great point. Well, on that note, we'll leave you with that thought-provoking question to ponder. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay secure.